It was the smell that did it. Not a gut-punching perfume or anything cliché like that, but something much worse. A mix of sweat, cologne, and something faintly metallic, lingering in the sheets when I crawled into bed late that night. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe the detergent hadn't fully masked the smell of a long day. But then I turned my head to Emily's pillow and inhaled, deep, slow, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But it was real, and it wasn't mine. My scent was always the same: aftershave, work, and the subtle hint of our home. This was different. It smelled like the inside of a stranger's car, like a cheap hotel room, like someone else had been there long enough to leave something behind. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body frozen in place as my mind started connecting dots I had refused to acknowledge before. The late nights. The way she had been showering the second she got home, even when she claimed she was exhausted. The new lingerie I hadn't seen her wear once for me. I had ignored it all, dismissed it, told myself that work stress or just life itself was making things weird between us. But this was undeniable. Smells don't lie. I heard the water running in the bathroom. Emily had come home a few minutes before me, muttered something about being exhausted, and had gone straight to shower, again. I forced myself to sit up, slowly, my fingers gripping the edge of the mattress like I was afraid I'd fall off the world if I let go. My stomach twisted as I glanced at the hamper near the closet, and before I could stop myself, I was on my feet, pulling open the lid. Her blouse was there, crumpled, looking like it had been peeled off in a hurry. I picked it up, brought it close to my nose, and there it was again. That same cologne, musky and sharp, mixed with the unmistakable scent of sweat and something that sent my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound of the shower stopped, and my hands clenched around the fabric as I turned toward the bathroom door. I had two choices: pretend nothing was wrong and let this eat me alive, or walk through that door and get the answers I already knew would destroy me. The door creaked open, steam spilling into the dimly lit room as Emily stepped out, a towel wrapped around her body, her wet hair clinging to her shoulders. She barely glanced at me as she walked toward the dresser, acting like everything was fine, like she hadn't just been scrubbing someone else's scent off her skin. I held up the blouse. "Whose is it?" She froze, her back to me, and for a moment, I could see the muscles in her shoulders tense just enough to tell me she had been caught off guard. She turned around slowly, her face carefully blank, but her eyes were moving too fast, calculating, searching for an answer that wouldn't dig her into a deeper hole. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was too steady, too rehearsed, and that alone was enough to confirm what I already knew. I took a step closer, lifting the blouse between us. "The smell, Emily. This isn't mine. This isn't ours." My voice came out rough, barely controlled, and I hated how desperate it sounded, how I was still clinging to the pathetic hope that she'd say something to make it all go away. She scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest like I was the one being ridiculous. "Jesus, Daniel, it's just perfume from work. I borrowed someone's jacket earlier, maybe it rubbed off." I threw the blouse onto the bed, my patience snapping like a frayed wire. "Stop lying." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Panic. Guilt. Something she was trying to bury under the defensive wall she was building with every passing second. She swallowed, shifting her weight, and I saw it. The way she was bracing herself, the way she was already preparing for the next lie, the next excuse. I took another step forward, lowering my voice, forcing her to look me in the eye. "Who is he?" And just like that, her mask cracked. Emily's face shifted in ways I'd never seen before, like she was searching for the right emotion to land on, but couldn't find one that would save her. She opened her mouth, closed it, then let out a breath that made my skin crawl. "Daniel, you're overreacting," she said, her voice low, controlled, as if she still thought she had some grip on the situation. "This is ridiculous." She reached for the blouse on the bed, grabbing it like she could erase the evidence just by holding it. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." I didn't move. My hands clenched at my sides, my breathing heavier than it should have been. "Who is he?" I repeated, my voice sharp, cutting through the stale air between us. She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head as she tossed the blouse back onto the bed like it had offended her. "You don't get to interrogate me like this," she snapped, finally finding some anger to wrap herself in. "I've been at work all day. I came home tired. and now you're acting like some jealous psycho over a stupid shirt? I could feel my jaw tightening, my patience stretching thin under the weight of her performance. You showered the second you got home, I said, keeping my voice steady, forcing her to look at me. And this isn't just a stupid shirt, Emily. It smells like someone else. It smells like you were with someone else. She rolled her eyes, a forced scoff leaving her lips as she turned away, heading toward the dresser like she was done with the conversation. I can't believe this, she muttered under her breath, yanking open a drawer. I didn't let it go. I stepped forward, closing the space between us, my voice calm but unrelenting. Tell me the truth. She stiffened for half a second before slamming the drawer shut, her back still to me. I could see the way her fingers curled against the wood, the way her shoulders lifted and fell too quickly. When she finally turned around, her face was set in frustration, but her eyes gave her away. There was something else beneath it, something that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with fear. You're acting crazy, she said, her tone quieter now, more measured, like she was trying to control the direction of the conversation. If you don't trust me, that's on you, but I'm not going to stand here and be accused of something I didn't do. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of every second dragging down on me. Then tell me where you were tonight. She blinked, her lips parting just slightly before pressing into a thin line. It was too small a reaction for most people to notice, but I saw it. I saw the way her body went rigid for a fraction of a second before she masked it with a forced sigh. I was at work, she said, staring at me like she dared me to challenge her. Like I told you. Until when? She crossed her arms, shifting her weight. I don't know, Daniel. 8, 9. I didn't check the time. I nodded slowly, my stomach tightening. So, if I check your location history, it'll show that you were at the office the whole time? Her eyes widened just enough to confirm everything I needed to know. It was a split-second reaction, but it was there, flashing across her face before she forced it away. Are you serious? She said, trying to laugh but failing miserably. You're going to track me now? Jesus, Daniel, do you hear yourself? I stared at her, feeling the last bit of denial slip through my fingers. I had given her every chance to tell the truth, to come clean, to say anything other than what I already knew was a lie. But she couldn't even do that. I nodded once, stepping back, putting distance between us as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't even have to open the app. I already knew what I'd see. You weren't at work, I said, my voice flat, empty. You were somewhere else. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her hands gripping her arms, her breathing shallow. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. You want to try again? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The air between us was thick, suffocating, filled with everything she wasn't saying. And then, finally, she broke. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze dropping to the floor, her jaw tightening like she was trying to hold something back. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was with someone, she admitted, her words slow, deliberate, like she was forcing them out one by one. But it's not what you think. A sharp, bitter laugh left my throat before I could stop it. It's not what I think. I repeated, staring at her in disbelief. Emily, you just admitted you were with someone else, and now you're telling me I'm wrong for thinking exactly what that means. She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the dresser behind her. It's complicated. I took a step forward, my voice dropping lower. Then make it simple. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but then she closed her mouth, shaking her head. I can't. I clenched my jaw, my fists tightening at my sides. You can't, I echoed, my voice flat. Or you won't. She let out a shaky breath, blinking rapidly like she was trying to keep herself together. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice strained. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean for any of this. I cut her off with a sharp shake of my head. Don't, I said, my voice cold, final. Don't stand there and act like this was some accident. You made a choice, Emily. You chose to lie to me, to sneak around, to... I gestured toward the blouse still sitting on the bed, my chest tightening. To come home with someone else's scent all over you. She closed her eyes for a second, her hands shaking as she exhaled. When she opened them again, there was something different there. Defeat. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered. I let out another bitter laugh, shaking my head. Yeah? Well, you did. The room felt different now, like something irreversible had shifted between us, like there was no going back from this moment. And maybe there wasn't. Maybe that was the point. I took one last look at her, at the woman I thought I knew, and realized I wasn't sure who I was even looking at anymore. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. Emily didn't try to come closer, didn't reach for me, didn't do anything except stand there with her back pressed against the dresser like she was trying to keep herself upright. I watched her, waiting, expecting her to fight back, to defend herself, to give me something. Anything. But she just looked at me like she already knew she had lost. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was her unsteady breathing, the occasional drip of water from her still wet hair hitting the floor. I could feel my own pulse hammering in my throat, my hands still clenched at my sides as the weight of her confession settled in. I took a step back, needing the space, needing something to ground me. How long? My voice came out rough, controlled, but inside, I was barely holding it together. Emily swallowed, her fingers gripping the edge of the dresser tighter. It's not. She stopped, exhaling sharply before trying again. It wasn't a relationship. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking my head. That wasn't the question. She flinched, her gaze dropping for a second before she looked back up at me. A couple of months. I nodded slowly, feeling the answer settle in my gut like a brick. So what? Once a week? Every other night? Tell me, Emily, how often did you sneak around behind my back? She pressed her lips together, shaking her head. It wasn't like that. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. Then tell me what it was like, I said, my voice low, sharp. Tell me how it happened. Tell me what you told yourself to make it okay. Tell me how you came home to me every night and pretended everything was fine. Her eyes were wide now, her breath coming faster, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her shrink away from this. Wasn't going to let her pretend it wasn't exactly what it was. She swallowed hard, gripping the dresser like she was afraid she'd fall over if she let go. I don't know, she admitted, her voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened. I finished for her, my jaw clenching. Right? Because people just accidentally fall into bed with someone else, right? Because that's how it works? Her face twisted in frustration, her fingers curling into fists. You think I don't hate myself for this? She snapped, her voice rising. You think I don't regret it every single day? I let out another bitter laugh, stepping back. Oh, I'm sure you do, I said, shaking my head. I bet every time you climbed into bed with me, you just hated yourself so much. I scoffed, crossing my arms. Must have been awful for you. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, exhaling through her nose before looking back at me. I wasn't happy, she said, her voice quieter now, but still defensive, still trying to justify what she did. I felt my chest tighten, my teeth grinding together as I fought to keep my voice steady. So that's my fault? Her eyes widened. I didn't say that. But that's what you mean, isn't it? I shot back. You weren't happy, so what? You found someone else to fill the gaps? Someone who made you feel special, made you feel wanted. I shook my head, the anger rising in my chest like a slow burn. And what was I? Just some idiot waiting at home, completely unaware. She let out a shaky breath, looking away, and for the first time, I saw something real, guilt, shame, something she couldn't hide even if she tried. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close to enough. Who is he? I asked, my voice sharper now, cutting through whatever pathetic attempt at remorse she was trying to show. Her head snapped back to me, her eyes widening again, and that alone was enough to confirm what I already knew. I could see it in the way her body tensed, the way her fingers twitched against the dresser. She had been hoping I wouldn't ask, hoping I wouldn't push that far. I took another step forward, lowering my voice. Tell me. She hesitated, her lips parting like she wanted to deny me the truth, but she must have realized it was pointless now. She looked away, inhaling sharply through her nose before whispering, "Someone from work." I exhaled through my nose, nodding slowly. Of course it was. Of course, it was someone she saw every day, someone she shared late nights at the office with, someone who had probably been circling her for months before she finally caved. What's his name? She looked at me, pleading now. Daniel, please. I took another step, forcing her to look me in the eye. Say it. She closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking. Eric. The name hit me harder than I expected. I knew Eric. I had met him. We had shaken hands. exchanged polite conversations at office parties, shared drinks at company events. He wasn't just some faceless stranger. He was real. He had looked me in the eye while fucking my wife behind my back. I let out a slow breath, nodding as I stepped back. Right. Emily's eyes were glassy now, her fingers trembling as she reached up to brush her hair back. I swear to you, it's over, she whispered. I ended it. I stared at her, my hands still clenched, my breath still coming too fast. When her face fell. Last week. I couldn't stop the laugh that escaped me, cold and humorless. Last week, I repeated, shaking my head. That's supposed to mean something to me? She looked like she was about to cry now, but I didn't care. I had spent months living in ignorance, months trusting her, months believing in something that had been broken right in front of me. If she wanted sympathy, she wasn't going to find it here. I need you to leave, I said, my voice flat, empty. Her eyes widened. What? You heard me, I said, stepping toward the door. Pack a bag and get out. Daniel, please, she said, her voice desperate now. Can we just talk about this? I turned back, my jaw tightening. We just did. She didn't move at first, like she thought I'd change my mind, like she thought she could somehow fix this. But when I stepped aside, holding the door open, she swallowed hard and nodded. Without another word, she turned, walking toward the closet and pulling out a bag. I didn't watch her pack. I didn't speak. I just stood there, waiting, breathing, trying to process the fact that the woman I had built my life with had destroyed it right in front of me. When she was done, she turned to face me one last time, her eyes red, her face tired, broken. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just stood there as she walked past me, her footsteps heavy, hesitant, before the door finally clicked shut behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I didn't move for a long time after the door closed behind her. The silence in the house felt unnatural, heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. My hands were still clenched at my sides. My breathing was still too fast, my heart still hammering against my ribs like it hadn't caught up to the fact that the fight was over. The weight of everything settled in slowly, pressing down on my chest until I had to sit down just to stop myself from collapsing. I ran a hand through my hair, staring at the floor, trying to piece together how I had gotten here. A few hours ago, I had been living in ignorance, assuming my wife was just tired, just distant, just going through something that had nothing to do with me. Now I knew the truth, and there was no way to unlearn it. Emily had cheated. She had lied to my face for months, kissed me, touched me, slept next to me every night, all while sneaking off to be with someone else. And the worst part? I hadn't seen it. I had trusted her completely, believed in our marriage, believed in her. Now I felt like an idiot for ever thinking she was different. I stood up, shaking off the daze that was creeping in, and walked toward the closet where she had packed her bag. The space where her clothes had been was still full, but there was just enough missing for it to feel incomplete. I didn't know where she had gone, and I didn't care. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. It rang twice before he answered. Daniel. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening on the phone. I need you to come over. There was a short pause on the other end before his voice came back, cautious. Everything okay? I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. No. Another pause, then a sigh. I'll be there in 10. I hung up, tossing my phone onto the couch before pacing the room. I didn't know what I was expecting to happen next, but I couldn't just sit in the house alone, drowning in the smell of Emily's shampoo, surrounded by everything she had tainted with her betrayal. I needed something, someone, to keep me from completely unraveling. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I opened it without hesitation, stepping aside as James walked in. He took one look at me and frowned, his eyes scanning my face like he already knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked, closing the door behind him. I swallowed, forcing the words out even though they felt like poison on my tongue. Emily cheated on me. James didn't react at first. He just stood there, staring at me like he was waiting for me to say I was joking. When I didn't, his jaw tightened, and he exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his face. Jesus Christ. I nodded, sinking onto the couch. Yeah. He sat down across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. How do you know? I let out another bitter laugh, shaking my head. She admitted it. His eyes darkened, his hands clenching together. Who? I hesitated for half a second before saying the name. Eric. James' entire body went rigid, his expression shifting into something that wasn't just anger, it was rage. Eric, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. As in her coworker? The one you've met? The one you fucking drank with? I nodded. He shot up from the couch, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair. I'm gonna kill him. I didn't say anything. I just watched as he struggled to contain the fury that I didn't even have the energy to express. James had known Emily almost as long as I had. He had been the best man at our wedding, had spent years believing in our marriage the same way I had. This wasn't just betrayal to me. It was betrayal to everyone who had ever thought we were solid. After a long moment, he stopped pacing, exhaling sharply before sitting back down. What now? I shook my head, rubbing a hand over my face. I don't know. James leaned forward again, his voice quieter now. Did she say why? I clenched my jaw, shaking my head again. She said she wasn't happy. He scoffed, shaking his head. So instead of talking to you, she fucked Eric? Apparently. James let out a low curse, leaning back against the couch, staring at the ceiling for a moment before looking back at me. And you kicked her out? I nodded. Good, he said firmly. She doesn't deserve to be here. I didn't respond. I wanted to believe he was right. Wanted to believe that kicking her out was the right thing to do. But there was still a part of me that couldn't process it. 12 years of marriage, gone in an instant. One choice, one mistake, one decision to betray everything we had built together, and now I was sitting here, trying to figure out how to move forward when all I wanted to do was go back and unsee everything I had just learned. James sighed, leaning his elbows on his knees again. You want me to do anything? I shook my head. No. Want me to track Eric down and beat the shit out of him? I almost laughed at that, but the exhaustion was too heavy. Not yet. James nodded slowly, rubbing his hands together. All right, but if you change your mind, you know where to find me. I nodded, appreciating the offer more than I could say. James wasn't the type to let things go, wasn't the type to sit back and let someone get away with something like this. If I gave him the word, Eric wouldn't be walking properly for a while. But right now, I didn't have the energy for revenge. I didn't have the energy for anything except sitting here, staring at the floor, trying to understand how my entire life had fallen apart in the span of a single night. James stayed for a while, not saying much, just sitting there, making sure I wasn't alone. And for that, I was grateful. Eventually, he stood up, clapping a hand on my shoulder before heading for the door. Call me if you need anything, he said, his voice steady. I nodded. Yeah. And then he was gone, and I was alone again, sitting in the wreckage of the life I thought I had, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. The house felt different with Emily gone, like the space itself knew she wasn't coming back. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, my mind running in circles. I replayed the entire night over and over, every word, every excuse, every moment where she could have told the truth, but didn't. The silence was thick, pressing down on me, and for the first time in years, I realized how much of my life had revolved around someone who had been lying to me for months. I stood up, running a hand down my face before heading to the kitchen. I wasn't hungry, but I needed something to do, something to occupy my hands, something to stop the rage that was slowly creeping in now that the shock had worn off. I opened the fridge, stared at the shelves for a few seconds before grabbing a beer, twisting the cap off without thinking. I leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip, feeling the cold liquid burn its way down my throat, but it didn't do anything to dull the feeling in my chest. My phone vibrated on the counter, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But when I glanced at the screen and saw Emily's name, my stomach twisted. I stared at the name, my finger hovering over the screen before finally swiping to answer. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. Daniel. I didn't say anything at first, just waited, letting the silence stretch between us. When I finally spoke, my voice came out colder than I expected. What do you want? She exhaled slowly, and I could hear the strain in her voice. I don't know where to go. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the counter. Not my problem. There was a pause, then a shaky breath. Daniel, please. Just talk to me. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Talk to you? You mean like how you talked to me before you started fucking Eric? She didn't respond right away, and for a second, I thought she had hung up. But then she let out a slow breath, her voice softer now. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I don't have anywhere else to stay tonight. I took another sip of my beer, staring at the floor. Figure it out. Another pause, then a sniff, like she was trying to hold back tears. You really don't care, do you? I gritted my teeth, gripping the bottle tighter. If I didn't care, I wouldn't be standing in my kitchen trying not to punch a hole through the wall right now. She inhaled sharply, and for a second, I could almost picture her standing there, looking as lost as she had when she left. I know you hate me, she whispered. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. Hate isn't the right word. She was quiet for a long time, and I thought maybe the conversation was over, but then she said something that made my blood run cold. I never meant to fall for him. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and my grip on the bottle tightened until I thought it might shatter in my hand. Jesus Christ, Emily. She must have realized how much damage she had just done because her voice turned desperate. I didn't mean it like that. You just what? I cut her off, my voice sharp. You just wanted to fuck him without feelings, and then, oops, you caught some? Do you hear how pathetic you sound? She let out a shaky breath, and I could hear the emotion in her voice now, like she was finally breaking under the weight of everything she had done. I don't love him, she said quickly. I never did. I swear to you, Daniel, I never stopped loving you. I laughed again, but this time it was full of nothing but disgust. You sure have a funny way of showing it. She sniffed again, and I knew she was crying now, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not after everything. I was stupid, she whispered. I was selfish, and I was wrong. But I need you to know that you were never the problem. I took another sip of my beer, forcing myself to stay calm. Does that make you feel better? She hesitated. What? Saying that? Telling me I wasn't the problem. Does that make you feel like less of a shitty person? She let out a choked sob, but I didn't react. I just stood there, waiting, letting her sit in the mess she had made. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said after a long moment. I don't want you to think this was because of you. I swallowed the last of my beer, setting the empty bottle on the counter with a dull thud. Emily. She sniffed again. Yeah. Don't call me again. The silence on the other end stretched out, thick and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Okay. I hung up without another word. I stared at the phone for a long time after the call ended, my hands resting on the counter, my breathing slow and controlled. I didn't feel relief, didn't feel anything except the dull, simmering rage that had been sitting in my chest since the moment I smelled someone else on her. She had just confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't some meaningless mistake. She had felt something for him, even if she tried to deny it now. I grabbed another beer from the fridge, twisting the cap off and taking a long drink, letting the cold settle in my chest. I should have felt better now that I had told her to leave me alone, but instead, I just felt empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, listening to the house creak in the silence. Every now and then, I'd reach for my phone out of habit, but there was no reason to check it. No reason to wait for a message. No reason to hope for anything. Emily was gone. And for the first time, I realized I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do next. The morning came without sleep. I sat on the couch as the sun rose, the empty beer bottles on the table in front of me, my phone face down beside them. I hadn't touched it since I hung up on Emily. There was no point. She wasn't going to call again, not after what I said. She had gotten the message. Maybe she had found a hotel, maybe she had gone to a friend's place, or maybe she was with him now. I didn't care. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. I pushed myself off the couch, my muscles aching from sitting too long. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I wasn't going to let myself sink into that feeling. I needed to do something, anything, to keep from thinking about what had happened. I went upstairs, heading straight for the closet. Her clothes were still here. She had only taken a small bag, probably assuming she would come back to get the rest later. Not happening. I grabbed a trash bag and started pulling her clothes off the hangers, throwing them inside without bothering to fold them. The scent of her perfume still clung to the fabric, and for a second, I hesitated, my grip tightening around a dress she used to wear on our anniversaries. I forced myself to shove it into the bag. She wasn't that person anymore. The woman who wore this, who smiled at me across candlelit dinners, who made promises she had no intention of keeping. She didn't exist. By the time I finished, I had 3 full bags. I hauled them downstairs, throwing them by the front door. I didn't know if I was going to drop them off at her work, leave them outside wherever she was staying, or burn them in the backyard. I'd figure it out later. Right now, I just wanted her out of my space. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made me pause. I glanced at the clock, barely past 9. I wasn't expecting anyone, but as I walked to the window and pulled the curtain back, I saw James stepping out of his truck, a coffee in one hand and a bag in the other. He didn't knock. He just walked in, letting the door close behind him as he looked around. His eyes landed on the trash bags, then on me. "You actually slept?" I let out a breath, shaking my head. "No." He nodded like he expected that answer and tossed the bag onto the counter. "Got you something to eat. Not gonna let you sit here and waste away over her." I wasn't hungry, but I grabbed the coffee anyway, taking a sip as James leaned against the counter, watching me. "You talked to her again?" I set the cup down. "She called last night. I told her not to call again." James smirked. "Good." He crossed his arms. "What's next?" I exhaled, glancing at the bags by the door. "Getting rid of her shit." "Need help?" I shook my head. "I got it." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You know this isn't over, right?" I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He scoffed, pushing off the counter. "Emily. She's not just gonna disappear and leave you alone. She's gonna come back, try to fix things, beg for another chance." I clenched my jaw, looking away. "Not happening." James shrugged. "Just be ready for it." I didn't want to talk about her anymore. I didn't want to think about the possibility of her trying to come back, trying to make me forget what she did. There was nothing left to fix. James must have noticed the shift in my expression because he changed the subject. "You coming out tonight?" I frowned. "For what?" He rolled his eyes. "To do something other than sit in this house, drinking yourself into a coma." I let out a breath, shaking my head. "I don't know, man." "Bullshit." James grabbed his coffee, taking a sip. "You need to get out. Get your head straight. We'll grab some drinks, maybe hit a pool hall, do something that doesn't involve you staring at the walls." I hesitated. The thought of going out, of pretending to be normal, felt exhausting. But sitting in this house, drowning in the weight of everything that had happened, wasn't much better. James raised an eyebrow. "Come on. What's the worst that happens? You have a few drinks and still feel like shit? At least you won't be feeling like shit alone." I sighed, rubbing a hand down my face. "Fine." He grinned. "Good. I'll pick you up at 8. James didn't stay long after that. He made sure I ate something before heading out, leaving me alone again with nothing but the bags by the door and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long time, staring at the pile of her things, before finally grabbing my keys. I didn't go to her work. I didn't text her to ask where she was staying. I just drove, ending up in front of a donation center on the other side of town. I didn't even think twice before dragging the bags out of the car and dumping them into the collection bin. She could figure out the rest. That night, James picked me up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I stepped out of that house, out of the mess she had left behind, and into whatever came next.